Um, and I guess when we start, one of the things that you wrote that really touched me, uh, I told you about the overall theme, Sisters in the Struggle, for our sermon worship series during Black History Month. And you said that I feel I have been in the struggle all my life, and that the issues of racism and sexism, classism have had definitive impact on my life in ways I am not free to walk away from. That struck me. And if you'd like to say a little bit more about that, just to talk about your life in general.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you again. As I said before, I'm very appreciative of this moment that we can engage in dialogue together. I was born in 1939 in what they call the red light district of Norfolk, Virginia. It was a poor neighborhood and an African American neighborhood, that to be born Black in America was to be born in a state of being that some would call forever inferior, and that everything around me in Jim Crow, Virginia, and Jim Crow, Norfolk, Virginia, would continually to reinforce that reality. And if I even ventured into a white neighborhood, first of all, by the color of my skin, I would seem out of place, but I would be questioned. I didn't carry a passcode card like they did in Africa, but I could only be in those communities if I were there to be a servant in those communities, serving as a maid or having some other form that required me to be of service to the whites in that community. And the police would stop you if you were in those communities. It was embodied in the very systems that I would have to deal with. The prejudice was combined with power, so that every system, whether it was a medical system or the hospitals, or whether it would be the school system or the church system, or where I could go to work, every system carried that prejudice in relationship to me. I was born in a system that would require, if I were to survive, if I were to live with some sense of humanity and dignity in my own self, I would have to fight every day of my life. So yeah, I began saying, not only am I a sister in the struggle, I am a woman who's been in the struggle for as long as I can imagine. And I told you, it was sort of funny. My sister, in the beginning of Black History Month, we were sending text all around about getting ready for Black History Month. And they have this picture of this woman, a Black woman, bless her heart. And the question under her was, do you think you're going to be able to withstand the storms that are coming at you in the midst of can you stand in the midst of the storm? And her response back was, what do you mean stand in the storm? I am the storm that we are dealing with.
And so, one of the questions that comes immediately to mind is, what is the thing that gives you the strength to survive, to struggle, to find dignity in the midst of such outrageous oppression? What gave you that ability to be the storm?
There are three things that have had unbelievable impact on my life and my being: to live. And there are three things. One, my family, my family, my family, my faith, my faith, my faith. And third, the ability to live in a community of persons that have helped me not to be locked in to a hate narrative, but to keep hope alive with a love narrative. And in that family, found a way to say to us each and every day, you are loved. We love you. And you are gifted. You've got within you a gift that God has given us. And so we were born in that understanding. And so in our household, faith was such an important part of my mother and father being able to instill with us. So we had prayer in the morning. And John, there's something about being prayed for by name. And my mother was saying, God, we bring Yvonne before you. Whatever she faces when she leaves this household, we ask that your power and presence will be with her. Be with her. She prayed for each of us by day. And at night, before we would go to bed, we had prayer again. It was a Black community, but it was a Black community that had come together to surround us with love. And as a teenager growing up in it, I knew I couldn't just get away with anything. And so sometimes when it looked like when I was a teenager and I was getting all excited about the boys and everything. And one day I was standing outside Miss Florence's house, who lived right next door to me, and I was talking to this guy. I thought he was just so handsome and everything. And she said to him, young man, just move along. Her mother doesn't want her spending time with you. She wants her head in the books. So you go your own way. And Yvonne is going home and get in the books. And when I moved into all of the places where I had to stand, even when I was in the negative, especially when I had to ride the bus to go somewhere, and you go into the front of the bus, put your dime or in, then you get off the bus and go into the back of the bus to sit in the back of the bus. Because of segregation, you were not able, you had to sit in the Black section. My father dug graves for a living. I want to say this part. And he made a decision that maybe we could have more money coming into the household if, in fact, we were able to put my mother to work alongside of his working. But he decided that Mama was needed to be there for us. His investment was in his children. He didn't want us to come to a house where there was no adult. He wanted my mother to be there so that so we could manage with less money, but more love that was there and more structure that was there.
And then of course, faith played a huge role, that your church and your church life.
There's no question. The church was for us free space. But when we stepped into that church on Sunday morning, we were in another world, and the narrative was another narrative, and it was a narrative of the love of God. When my mother walked in with her Sunday go to meeting dress, when my daddy walked in with his good suit on Sunday, he was called Deacon Delk. When he was in the other world, they didn't even give him a title. They would address my father by his first name. No value, no sense of honor or respect. When we walked into that church, Daddy was a deacon in that church, and he had value. He had purpose. When my mother walked in, she had that. When we walked in as a family, we were surrounded by a narrative to say, you are the children of God. And when they came into our church, it was release time as well. I mean, I came up in a church that had shouting in it, that had praise in it, unbelievable. And my mother would just walk all over that church and praise. And she would say, when I just think about the goodness of God.
And then that faith got further developed by a place that we've heard about through our mutual friend Nancy, that's still active and alive and thriving today. And that's a Franklinton Center at Bricks.
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
I loved it because I considered it vacation time. But it was also a time to nurture us deeper into the faith that we were a part of. And so the structure for the camps and conferences was that we would go and we would be there for one whole week. And during that week, they would talk about what it meant for us to be in God's world. And of course, nature was all around us. So we learned how to be appreciative of nature. And so and we got to see some of the other pastors and young people who were a part of this Afro-Christian connection. And we looked forward to us. Started out at 6 years of age, going to Franklinton Center at Bricks. And from the time I was 6 until I graduated from high school, I would go every summer. And by the time that I graduated from high school was when they began to tap me to say, Yvonne, we don't know what you're planning on doing as you get ready for college, but we want you to think about serving the church in some way. I started out as a young person, 6 years of age, and now I'm considered one of the council of elders that surround the Franklinton Center at Bridge.
We've heard so much about being surrounded by strength and encouragement and affirmation, and then they called you to go to Andover Newton.
Oh, was that a hard piece? That was
Oh my God.
it had to interact with the white world that was around, but for the most part, I had been defined by those teachers, the pastors, the community, my family, everything that was around me was affirming me in every way that was possible and feeding into me a sense of call. Unity. It was not in my mind growing up for any larger world at that point. And I was just as happy being willing to go to Virginia Union in Virginia, which was a Black seminary, not far from home. Richmond was no more than 2 hours away from home, still in a Black environment. That's where my head was. However, Purcell Austin, who was at that time an African-American minister who had gone to Andover Newton Theological Seminary, Purcell Austin began to create a new narrative. Well, when Purcell comes to my household and says to my mother, this is going into my senior year in college, I was thinking about Yvonne applying at Andover Newton Theological Seminary. I had never heard of an Andover Newton Theological Seminary. And, and he said to my mother, it's time. You've given her roots. It's time for her now to move into a wider narrative. And what was amazing is that my mother accepted that it was time for me, that the call on my life was further than the lines that I had drawn. And my mother trusted God, that whatever God would send me, because she had prayed for me each and every day. And her prayer was that same God would be with me when I moved into Andover Newton. So I went to bed one night, had a wonderful dream. And the dream was about women surrounding me. And these were the women that I valued. It was my mother praying, who had prayed over me each and every day of my life. It was of Mary McLeod Bethune, because I had written about her, and she was a shero based on how she had given her life and the way in which she had affirmed our race and the whole. She was in it. My grandmother that I told you on my father's side, which was a holiness minister, was in it. And the one woman that I've carried in my heart and spirit and is in my household today, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth, the narrative of Sojourner. We live by the narratives, and I'd always affirmed Sojourner, and she was in my heart and in my spirit. And I'm in this dream, and they're there. And I'm in a circle, and they are surrounding me, and they're sending their spirits to me, so that I feel when I wake up from the dream that I've been empowered by the spirit of these women to move. I woke up feeling that I had to say yes, even though I didn't know fully what I was in for. And so even with all my struggles and everything, I boarded a bus, Greyhound bus, traveled from Norfolk, Virginia to Andover Newton. And the first part of my life there, that first year was a hard year. It was a hard year because in many ways, the question, how do you sing the Lord's song in a strange and alien land, was very true to me. Everything at Andover Newton had very little to do with the world that I had been a part of leading up to that. At that point, there were no women who were on the faculty. I had been nurtured by strong women, no question. All of my professors, except Henry Brooks, were all white males. I had no meaningful relationships with any person that was of a different color than I was. And so to move into that setting, and then because I was so late, women were all down the hill in Chase House. Now, this is the story of Franklin, which and of Newton, which you knew. At the time I came, women were at the bottom of the hill. Everything that dealt with male, that's the sexism part of this, I was at the top of the hill, at the top of the hill. And so the women, 13 of us, all lived together in Chase House at the very bottom of the hill. Every room had been fulfilled before I said yes. And so when I said yes, they had to find a bed. So they put me in a room where 3 other white women already existed at the apex of Chase House. They put another cot in, and now there were 4 women in there rather than 3. And one of those women was Nancy McKinney. The relationships that are formed that help us to find our way to each other across the barriers that have separated us before. The relationships that are formed that help us to see each other in terms of I am, the Ubuntu phrase is I am because you are, and because you are, I can be also. It is a way of understanding how we come together and a deep appreciation of who we can be together across the barrier, and the struggle to be men and women being equipped for the gospel of Jesus Christ in a world where the barriers were still as strong as they were, meant that I was in a struggling community. And at least that was new. I had not been in a community of men and women who were struggling with the reality of what it meant for us to be men and women, sons and daughters of God. Not all of us were at the same, but we were struggling. I can't remember all that I wrote. I can't remember all the lectures that I had. I remember the communities that was formed. I remember when Harvey Cox, who was on the staff there, said, we live in the hill and going into Roxbury, where we will be ministering in the context, putting our faith to work in the context. And so Nancy and I and others who went, Ron Hafer, I can still see us now going into Roxbury, where there the faith came alive as we sought to minister to one another. As we created programs and resources where the children were coming in the men. It was in fact embodying that faith, not high and lifted up on a hill, but moving directly into the heart of the city. And it was us deciding to leave that hill and to ride the buses directly from Boston into the eastern shore of Maryland, moving into the place where the powers and principalities were determined to stay with the old worldview. And sisters and brothers now that I had formed at Andover Newton, white sisters and brothers boarded with me and others in the area where we rode together, where we approaching, hearing the helicopters above us swirling, where we see that bus roaring into people, where the faces are hate, where we see the dogs and the police, knowing that we're going to step out into a reality that would be different from the classroom, a reality where we had to witness to our faith, and that we would step together in those places, a community.
And of course, Nancy McKinney, our local saint, is a genius at connecting people from so many different places in life.
She took me home for the first time. I met her family for the first time. It was amazing. I was in her wedding. I was a bridesmaid in her wedding, and it was amazing to be able to really, in a wonderful world that you are part of, to be able to have those connections to persons that keep your hope alive. You know, Jesse would always say, keep hope alive, keep hope alive. Well, how do you keep hope alive if we're so separated from each other? How do you keep hope alive if we don't have an opportunity to walk together, to be together, to go through ups and downs, to really be human with each other, to flow in the midst of it?
And then, of course, I think the vision of your community, your pastor, came to fruition in ways I don't know anybody understood, because you assumed leadership of the National United Church of Christ offices
Purcell had put my name. My name is now moving in the system. And he is talking to the Board for Homeland Ministries, where there's Howard Sprague, because he has now been called. He had been serving the Convention of the South, but as soon as the new denomination, Purcell was one of the new staff persons with the Board for Homeland Ministries and the Division of Christian Education of this new United Church of Christ. He was there, my mentor, and he had already named me in that setting. And there is nobody else quite like me. I'm the first African-American female from the Afro-Christian denomination that had gone on to Andover Newton. There was, I had come early before the women's movement. Many of the African-American women came in the 70s in the midst of the women's movement. So I knew I was a part of a denomination, at least, that was attempting to crack through those barriers that divide, was attempting to bring down those walls. And here was a new denomination willing to name that and face that and to begin. But however, it was a denomination that was predominantly white. And that the Blacks who would be a part of it would be forever a small percentage of this predominant. And yet to have it stand to really be able to begin to address the racial divide. And I entered in 1969 when we were at Park Plaza Hotel. James Foreman, who is a part of a group that is pressing these white churches and denominations and organizations to stand up for the complicity, their part in the complicity of slavery. And so he had come to confront our denomination. But when we got, rather than to figure out a way we could hear each other into space, we became defensive and we said no. And so what happened was they took out an injunction barring him from being able to even engage the dialogue with a Black manifesto that basically said, you owe for the part of your complicity in slavery, and you've got to invest now in dismantling this in these ways. African Americans and whites who believed in justice were already beginning to mobilize. I walk in, I'm going to be presented now from the Board for Homeland Ministries, going to present me as the first African American female in a programmatic position, Secretary for Urban, and I'm going to be presented at that Senate. I'm going to be introduced to the whole Senate as a part of the Board for Homeland Ministries program. I walk in and the brothers and sisters said, we're meeting upstairs because we will confront this Senate. So now suddenly, rather than to be presented at the Senate, we got a group that's going to confront the Senate for its complicity and racism and its complicity and inequities in the Senate. So I go upstairs and sure enough, there's Jim Foreman and there are the ministers for racial justice meeting. And they said, tomorrow morning when this Senate begins, we will take the stage. And we will not allow it to begin until the injunction is lifted against Jim Foreman. And that this church that says it wants to work for the humanity of all mankind, he wants to work to create a sense of wholeness for all of us until it demonstrates that it's willing to hear a prophet that we call a prophet and to speak. So I said, oh my God, this is my first Senate. I'm being prepared to be presented. And now I got to decide, how do I enter this church? How do I enter for my first act? And I had decided I'm not going to be in my seat while sisters and brothers are walking the aisle to confront the denomination. So I entered the denomination in a moment, 1969, where there was a confrontation, challenging this denomination to live up to what it believed in. So from the moment I entered, I knew that we were going to have to push for this vision that we had. We were going to have to stand for this vision we had. We were going to have to risk for it if we had any chance of becoming the beloved community that we said we hoped for. And it was in that context that we stayed up there singing freedom songs. Because, when I said, the fight for freedom is constant. It's constant. It's ongoing. The fight for us to become the beloved community of God is ongoing. And that was the beginning of a journey that would move me from being the Secretary for Urban and Black Church Education to being asked to head its whole social justice arm of the denomination. From 1980 until 1990, I headed the Office for Church and Society. It was at that 69 Senate that the second president of the denomination was elected. Bob Moss was at that Senate with all that was going on. And then they came to me. I had just gotten there. They said, we're going to install the new president of the church, the second president of the United Church of Christ. We're going to install him. We want you to charge him with the mantle of standing for racial justice. Me, I had just gotten there for 6 months. I said, no, I'm not the person. I said, go to Charlie Cobb. He heads the Commission for Racial Justice. He's been here all along. You need to call him to make that charge. And they said no. And I'm going to tell you why. I think they needed a female. Everybody else in the program was male. Okay. But Charlie said, Yvonne, they didn't ask me. They asked you. All I ask that you stand on what you know to be the truth. You stand for what you know. They've asked. So here I am, brand new to this denomination, standing first on a stage to say, lift the injunction, hear this prophet into speech. 6 months later, I'm standing on a stage challenging the second president of the United Church of Christ to carry the mantle for justice, racial justice, in every aspect of our life. Carry it, speak for it, stand for it, represent it. You never know what the call of God on your life. I'm grateful that as we talk on this day, on a Monday, on this day, that it has been the word of God flowing with a different narrative. Not David. It was Avery Post, who was the fourth president, that put my name in for the World Council of Churches and allowed me to represent this whole denomination on the world stage, where I moved and the World Council of Churches asked me to head its Commission for Racial Justice, the program to combat racism. For 9 years, I served as the director of that program that fought apartheid in South Africa and fought for justice in the United States. It opened up a world that I could have never imagined. And yet I think about a praying mother who prayed over me when I was a young girl, that the armor of God and the protection of God would be in me and in my life, and would empower me to be the person that God would intend for me to be. I was so honored at the 1979 Senate. I received the Antoinette Brown Award. I invited my mother and father to stand with me on the stage. They flew from Norfolk to that Senate. When I walked up, I walked with them. I would not have been there had it not been for them, who invested so much in me. And I stood with them, and that whole Senate stood, applauded my mother and my father. My father, who had been a grave digger, who sacrificed to have my mother stay, to invest in me, and to be able to stand with me in that moment.
The first time when we talked, you talked about hope, and thinking about your life. I'm still trying to figure out, after all those struggles, you still find hope. So maybe I can finish this as just tell me, where do you find hope?
Oh, I find it in so many places these days. When I think about my mother and father, when I think about so many of those who came before us, who invested so much in us, that we might be able to have that was within us, to be able to stand in the midst of these moments. The seeds that they put in us is enabling me to stand, and the seeds that I invest in others enables others to stand and touches others. So my hope is that is in all of those that do see it different, who do see it different. And while I can name chapter and verse of those who don't, I also have chapter and verse of those who are working each and every day towards the vision, the same vision that I, in fact, am working for. So last year, my hope just jumped a mile when I was listening to the president's inaugural activity and a young lady by the name of Amanda Gorman.
Yeah.
She heard, she received from those of us who've been standing the mantle, and in her own way, own understanding, still carries the torch. Hope in a generation. When I looked out in the Black Lives Matter, when George Floyd piece was so horrible, to see the knee on his neck, to see the life force being taken out of him. And then across the nation and the world, young people, people across racial lines, young people standing for a different world, not a world where we crush the life out of each other with our knee to their neck, but a world where we can realize that we all matter. To see the witness in so many ways, I draw strength and hope from that. It is so wonderful. I was with so many of, I go to a number of the women's meetings in the early days of the United Church of Christ. We were having a hard time here in the Southern Conference with men getting themselves together. It was a hard time because the whites still embodied very much, but it was the women.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The women's fellowship, the women's heart, mind, and spirit. White women and Black women coming together across these boundaries, finding a way to meet together. We kept the women's fellowship groups of the Afro-Christian Convention going through all of the 60s into the 70s. They had a chapter because it was the place where they could really grow it, but they built another path together. So these women found a way to come together, a women's fellowship. So the women's fellowship, it exists to this very day, the new racially inclusive women with a vision. That's hope for me. That is hope for me. Still working for it. I have hope that you would call me up and say, would you be willing to be a part of a dialogue that continues? I have hope when a Nancy McKinney is able to come to Norfolk, Virginia and sit with my sisters and brothers and the family and celebrate. And when I go to Boston, sit with her daughters and family, just to be human with each other, just to be in a relationship with each other, that makes it a part of witnessing to the world that you really ought to be natural. It ought not to be unnatural, natural. I have hope in the midst of it all. And I have hope in a new generation that's coming, a new generation. I have hope in terms of our being able to continue to function in a way that what we do, and that's my hope for this denomination too, that pastors like you and people who hear that in the midst of it, that we're working for a world where we really do believe all of us can exist in harmony and love and affirmation together. So that keeps my hope alive. And things are changing. Things are in many ways still a struggle. As I said in my letter to you when we were trying to frame this, we're still fighting for the right to vote, and that's going to be real. But there are people who are standing up for it, just as there are people who witness against it. There are people who are standing for it and who will fight for it. We're still fighting down here in Virginia and in many school places where folk are saying, I don't want my kids to feel guilty about all of those injustices that you talked about at the beginning of this conversation. I don't want them to feel guilty. I don't want them to know about it. The idea is not to create guilt, But the idea is to create an awareness of what happens when, in fact, we do not lead with our love and appreciation for each other. It is to find a way that we don't repeat that which has been the part that change will happen, and that we will find our ways. But if we can't name it and see it, but there are many who are rising up. They're banning books, but there are many people who are standing up against the banning of the books. They're holding up the book. So for every person who believes like me, we who believe in freedom just can't rest until it comes. But every act, I draw strength from that. I draw strength from that.
Well, Yvonne, as I mentioned to you earlier, we're talking about Beatitudes in Luke this Sunday morning, and I clearly said you are a blessing, but I am without a doubt saying you are blessed in every countercultural way that Jesus envisioned when he opened his mouth and said those words. I think he must have been thinking of you. I don't know. And I like to thank you and to say that amongst the pulpits in the world, the one in Bedford is open whenever you want to come up. And believe me, there's more than one bed for you to sleep in here in Bedford. We love to wine and dine you and embrace you if you could ever get up here. And we look forward to visiting Franklinton Center and developing a new relationship that I think really will transform hearts and minds beyond our imagination. So thank you so much, Yvonne. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. And I look at this as the beginning,
Yep.
as the beginning, as
Yep.
the beginning. And my hope is that God has let me live for these 80-some years to be able to see this moment as well,
Yes.
and to keep on walking towards that vision and dream. And so the fact that we have this moment to continue that walk together warms my heart very much.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much, and God bless.
All right.